Yeah, when you think about the timing of reproduction, there's a lot of things that can impact that, right? If you're a deer in a more northern state like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, you have things to contend with like the winter, right? We don't think about that oftentimes here in Mississippi, but if you have about a 200 to 210 day gestation, right? And you're born at a certain time of the year, you only have so many days to put on enough body weight to survive a winter. And that becomes a really big factor in all this, really important thing to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. We try to complicate this quite a bit, but if you're wanting to ensure that your offspring has the best chances of living, you want to make sure that they hit the ground at an ideal time. And when you start talking about the North versus the South, well, we have a relatively mild winter. We have a longer growing season. There's more time for error, if you will.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Jacob Dykes.
And I'm Eric Mitchell, and we're the co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab.
As hunters, deer biologists, and wildlife professors, we're passionate about bridging the gap between research and management.
Each episode, we explore the latest deer research from around the country, breaking it down to discuss how it can improve wildlife and habitat management on your land.
Whether you're a hunter, a land steward, or simply interested in deer biology, Deer University is for you.
All right, Eric, we're back. Got another episode. One of our favorite things to do is if we don't do it all of the time, is talk deer management, right?
Absolutely.
So it's always good to turn the cameras on and show people what we're always talking about. So Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite things. If you're a hunter, I'm sure this is probably one of the things you look forward to most in the year, and that is the rut.
Yes, it is that magical time of the year. Most of hunters across the deer range are experiencing that right now, or are very near experiencing that. It is a magical time in the deer woods.
Absolutely magical. This is when deer, especially bucks, we start talking about peak rut and stuff. But this is where they act like deer the rest of the year, and then just kind of go a little crazy this time of year.
Yep.
So, we talk about the rut as if it occurs, at one time period across the country, but that's not the case, right? You see a lot of variability in breeding. And especially when you start looking from like up north to your more southern latitudes down here where we are, it varies a whole lot, but it also varies a lot within the South.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the driver to all this?
Yeah, when you think about the timing of reproduction, there's a lot of things that can impact that, right? If you're a deer in a more northern state like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, you have things to contend with like the winter, right? We don't think about that oftentimes here in Mississippi, but if you have about a 200 to 210 day gestation, right? And you're born at a certain time of the year, you only have so many days to put on enough body weight to survive a winter. And that becomes a really big factor in all this, really important thing to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. We try to complicate this quite a bit, but if you're wanting to ensure that your offspring has the best chances of living, you want to make sure that they hit the ground at an ideal time. And when you start talking about the North versus the South, well, we have a relatively mild winter. We have a longer growing season. There's more time for error, if you will. But up north, as you know, I'm from down south. I've only hung out a couple of times up there. But as you know, there's some times where you don't want to hit the ground and expect to be able to live, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And deer are pretty remarkable in that sense. So you think about a fawn, and we're getting not necessarily a little bit off topic, but a little bit on a tangent here. And I think it's worth going down this road. You have essentially a trimester gestation period, right? And the first 2 semesters of that trimester period, you're going across wintertime. And there's not a whole lot of fetal development occurring at that time. There's just not a lot of food on the ground, right? Most of that development's going to occur in that last trimester, which corresponds with spring green up, right? So that's the first thing that we start thinking about here. And then that fawn hits the ground. Now you have an energetically demanding time period for the mother with lactation. That fawn's trying to put on body weight. And it all occurs when there's a lot of resources on the ground. And that's a little bit more lax down here in the Southeast, like we talked about, right? Like if you hit the ground, that's in part why we see fawns that hit the ground from June to August, depending upon where you're at in the state.
Yeah. And to keep, Mother Nature working as it should, the main driver of all of this, of when a deer goes into estrus, when a deer conceives, and then eventually when that fawn hits the ground, is that photo period that I'm sure most of people have heard of. But it is essentially, photo period is the amount of daylight within a 24-hour period. And as we know, we can see it ourselves, that changes throughout the seasons of the year.
Yeah, and it all relates back to the pineal gland within a deer, and that's responsible for releasing melatonin, which is associated with the amount of daylight, right? And from there, all sorts of different hormones, including testosterone, emerge. So it becomes a really big factor in all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and we think about bucks and the things that they go through, but once a buck has shed its velvet, it's ready to breed at any time. It's really just a waiting game for when those does come into estrus or heat. That's really what's going to trigger that rut. So you see this change in photo period, and you start to see does come into estrus, and then of course we talk about that bell-shaped curve. You'll see a few come into estrus, but then you start to see the majority of them come into estrus at about that same time. And that's what's really going to get that rut going, get the bucks chasing, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, so this changes across the deer's range that we just talked about, right? But the intensity is kind of what we're talking about here. So up north, you might have a much higher peak, a much shorter time period where you have a peak breeding occurring. And you are still going to have that bell curve if you're in the southeast, but it might just look a little bit different, might be a little bit more relaxed relative to our northern counterparts.
Yeah, probably just stretched out a little bit further
Yeah.
because, you could have a fawn down here and it not hit the ground at ideal time and it still would likely be okay. But up north, it may very well freeze to death.
Yep.
It's just not going to make it. Right. So, so you often hear about the phases of the rut. So if this is all triggered by a photo period, bucks essentially waiting on does to go into estrus, but you have what we refer to as the pre-rut, and that's a really exciting time right here in North Mississippi that we're starting to see, because you start to see the scrapes and you start to see the rubbing on the trees. And, I stuck a camera out a week ago, and in one night I had 4 bucks on the same scrape. It's really, really cool behavior that we all appreciate. But essentially, you've got that pre-rut, you're starting to see those cool behaviors, and it's just the start of what's going to happen, right? It's just everybody getting geared up for the majority of those does to come into estrus, and then that peak rut.
Yeah.
And in our neck of the woods, here sitting in Starkville, it's December 25th to January 7th is when we see about 50% of the does are going to be bred. That is that peak.
Yep. And, taking it back to those scrapes, those are really important in that pre-rut time period, right? So you have a lot of deer that are hitting those scrapes, they're depositing scent, and they serve as a communication site for other deer to kind of have a better understanding of who's in the area, who's moving around, what does this all look like? Everything from those scrapes and those rubs, it's all communication.
Yeah. And that's like I was mentioning the 4 deer in one night. They're all they're checking by to see who's been through there, what's going on, anybody new showed up. I mean, there's a lot of really good communication that goes on, a lot that we don't understand.
Yeah.
But very cool time of the year.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, if you look at Mississippi, you see that we've got a big variation in rut timing, right? And it tends to happen where within a given space, it tends to happen at the same time every year. There's not a lot of variability within a given area. Let's say, for example, in North Mississippi, DeSoto County, Tunica, that kind of thing, you start to see anywhere from that November 30th to the December 12th, that 2-week period of that peak rut. And then, like I mentioned here where we are in Starkville, that December 25th to January 7th. So even within a state, there's a lot of variability. And, we get a lot of questions about that. Well, why is it so weird? Why are there pockets where it seems like it's a little bit different than other areas? And it goes back to, like you were saying, those selective pressures. For whatever reason, that's the way that they've done it. And there's no reason to change because the fawns have continued to survive. And that maternal influence is passed down to the daughters. Like, hey, this is when you're going to breed. This is when your fawns are going to hit the ground. And it works until it doesn't work.
Yep, exactly. And there's a huge variation here in Mississippi. And we, that's something we talk about a lot with our local deer hunter population. But even if you go a couple states over into Florida, it's something like deer are breeding 9 months out of the year in Florida, because there's just an even bigger gradient range of breeding dates in that state. And it's got to be likely related to environmental pressures, right? If you are in a subtropical climate, what's the pressure for you to breed at one point in time of the year versus another, right? It's just a lot more laxed.
Yeah. Well, if it worked this year, we'll do it again next year,
And if it doesn't, then they don't persist.
They don't do it again next year. So, I've always found it fascinating. I also get this question quite a bit is I mentioned that the rut happens the same time every year within those given spaces, right? Or given places, I should say. And so, for example, that December 25th to January 7th here in Oktibbeha County, it's been that way as long as I can remember. And I don't imagine it's going to change unless something drastically changes with the climate or with, the environment, I should say. But I've also think it's interesting how we know this. So the MDWFP herd health checks.
Yeah. You start talking about monitoring programs and collecting data. I mean, these are things that we're not just throwing numbers out there, right? We have some pretty sound evidence to show us when breeding is occurring. So with a spring herd health check, go out and maybe seem a little counterintuitive, but this is how we gain so much of our information. We actually harvest pregnant does and measure the fetus. And based on that growth curve, we can backdate to when conception likely occurred. And that is how we have a better understanding of when actual breeding occurs in Mississippi.
Yeah. And it is a really cool process. It's been super helpful in deer management, but it's also, it's very, very interesting. Those things have showed the same thing over and over each year and each year. The rut tends again to happen. And I guess I keep saying that because you often hear, well, the rut's going to kick in earlier this year because it's colder.
Full moon.
It's full moon. Exactly. And just the research, decades and decades and decades of research shows that those things do not influence the rut whatsoever. It is literally driven by that photo period. And what you can expect this year will happen next year in most cases.
Yeah. Yeah. So we take it back to that bell curve, right? So when I was in South Dakota, I analyzed some data. And basically we showed that something like 80% of reproduction, 80% of breeding is going to occur in a 2-week period, right? But that's a running average. So you have this bell-shaped curve that peak breeding is going to occur in a 2-week span. That can shift a little bit across those 2 weeks, but generally speaking, we're talking about a 2-week period, right? And that can be a little bit tighter depending on where you're at within the deer range, or like we just talked about, a little bit more lax if you're south. So it's going to occur about the same time every year within a time frame. Now that makes it difficult. And I think where the conversation goes is what days we take off to go hunting, right? And everybody wants to know, is it going to happen today or tomorrow? And so they can actually plan that rutcation, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, also we think about this as just that is the 2-week peak that we talk about, but also like the behaviors we had just mentioned with the rubs and the scrapes and that kind of thing. That is also a fun time of year, but that is that pre-rut. Typically when they get into the rut and start, the real rutting behavior that we so much appreciate, they leave all that other stuff alone. And now it's just about, okay, well, I'm going to spend all my time pursuing does. So exciting time of year nonetheless. But you often hear, and we addressed this a couple of times, but you hear about that secondary rut or that trickle rut. And I feel like that gets more and more common every year. But I wanted to bring those words up because that goes back to that bell-shaped curve that you mentioned. You can expect there are going to be does come into the estrus very early. So if you just so happen to see that first couple of does come into estrus, you're going to be like, oh, well, the rut's here. Well, those just may be the very early deer. And then again, you're going to see the majority of those happen at a given time. And then you're going to have some of those stragglers as well that I think a lot of people say the secondary rut or the trickle rut.
Yeah.
But again, we've got the evidence to show that the rut within a given site happens the same time each and every year.
Yep. And exactly. You've got that bell-shaped curve. You're going to have some does come in early. You're going to have a peak occurring right at the tip of that bell-shaped curve, and then a few does coming in late. And then you also hear about the secondary rut later on in the season, right? The second bell-shaped curve, the second peak, and that can happen for one of two reasons. One is really good, and one is not so great. And we hear about that all the time, but it really comes down to whether or not the juvenile does, so your doe fawns, 6 months of age, if they hit a critical body mass, that allows them to come into estrus. And that just so happens to occur right around, about 30 days post peak rut. The second, and that's a good thing. That means you have a healthy deer population. That's a positive thing. The not positive thing is if you have adult mature does that are coming into their second estrus, which generally means that there's a really high deer density and not all those deer are being bred in the first estrus. So they'll recycle again until they're bred.
Yeah, that goes to that skewed buck to doe ratio. We often hear you want 1 buck per 2 does or 1 buck per 1.5 does, something like that. Well, I think it does have to get pretty far out of whack to see big issues, but that is one that you can see. If you've got too many does and the bucks literally can't breed them all, and we should mention that when a doe goes into estrus, we're talking about a 24 to 48 hour period where they are susceptible to breeding. If they are bred and it's not successful, then 28 days later, they will go back into estrus. Or if they're not bred for whatever reason, maybe you've got too many does running around, again, 28 days later, they'll do that again. And some of the research has shown that they will do that up to 7 times.
7 times.
So if you can imagine, you were prolonging your rut a month every time that these does come into aren't bred when they come into estrus. So that skewed buck to doe ratio can really cause issues, especially if you're talking about somewhere up north where if those fawns don't hit the ground at the right time, they
Yeah.
don't make it. We can get by with that down in the south because we have such a temperate climate, but it's still a problem. You want the majority of your does to be bred at the same time so that those fawns are hitting the ground at the same time because they've just evolved to make sure they hit the ground when they're most likely to have the nutrition they need to grow. Also, if you think about predator swamping,
Just going to say it.
yeah, I mean, you want most of the fawns to hit the ground at the exact same time so that coyotes are overwhelmed. Yeah, they'll get a few, but for the most part, they'll be overwhelmed, and most of those fawns are going to be just fine.
Yep. That's an important consideration too. It all kind of works in synchrony.
Yeah. Well, Mother Nature knows what it's doing. We just tend to get in the way, right?
Yep, exactly.
And I also think it's fascinating. You said for the one good reason, though it's very low in the South, you do see sometimes your fawns will breed, but they have to reach that critical mass, like you said. So I think, some of the numbers I've seen in the South is they need to hit 70 pounds as a fawn for them to be able to reproduce. And so if you do see that happening, then chances are it's going to happen late December, late January, just based off timing to gain weight, right? So they'll hit the ground in July and then maybe December, January, they've hit that 70 pounds here in the South and have the ability to breed. So that could prolong your rut as well, but that's pretty rare in the South. I think it's much more common up north.
Yeah.
I think that critical mass is 80 pounds up north is what you'll find in the literature.
Yeah. And generally speaking, you'll have, I think some of the percentages, I was thinking 30, 40% of your fawns will hit that critical mass and then they'll reproduce. It's really interesting. You start thinking about weight gain over winter, right? Now, it's more important at northern latitudes, but you'll see this obligatory weight gain, weight response, right? Where all the nutrition, everything that they're eating, it's all getting turned into fat and storage for surviving those winter months. So a body mass is a little bit different up north than it is down here.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense completely. Absolutely.
It's cold up there. It just is.
Really cold. Okay. So just kind of a recap. So when we talk about the rut, we are talking about breeding season. So there is a pre-rut, a peak rut, and a post-rut, the three phases of the rut that we often hear. Now, the rut is going to occur the same time within a given area each year, and it is going to be driven by photoperiod, not weather, not the moon. It's photoperiod. It's the change in the amount of daylight within a 24-hour period. So that is the real driver. And all of this stems from the fact that these animals have evolved to make sure that fawns hit the ground when they've got the best chances of being successful. So we often look at, pre-rut, like we mentioned, the scrapes and the rubs, but the peak rut is when we all get so excited because we know that those bucks that have been being deer all year long suddenly turn into a different animal. And so we've seen a lot here lately on how does the rut influence movement. You want to speak on that just a little bit, buck movement?
Yeah. So there's been some work that's been done on this before. There was most recently a paper that just came out of UW-Madison with their big study that they had southwestern Wisconsin there, and it's really just kind of reiterating some of the same things that we've seen in other studies, right? So if you think about buck movement, it's generally going to increase throughout the fall, right? Yeah, velvet shed and buck movement generally increases. Now, the two things that are pretty consistent there is the time of day that you're going to see peak movement, and that's going to be dusk and dawn, regardless of whether it's September, October, or peak rut November, whenever that might be in your area. Buck movement is going to peak at dusk and dawn. Now, we all think about when we're talking about peak seeking phase, right? We all have this idea in our heads, or at least I think most of us do, of seeing big bucks moving on their feet all day long. And I think, or at least I know as I've gotten older and experienced more peak ruts, that seems to not be the norm, right? We still see, like I said, peak movement, dusk and dawn, and every once in a while you'll have that day thrown in there where it's just deer moving all day long. Well, what the study out of Wisconsin showed is that, yes, you have peak movement, dusk and dawn. It's a U-shaped curve. So peaking at dusk, lowest midday, peaking again at dawn. But that midday movement increases across the rut. So it's still the lowest probability of deer moving during the day, but that time or that movement increases as you go throughout the rut. And then again drops off post rut. So you see a peak movement midday at peak rut, but again, dusk and dawn is still going to be your best bet to see deer activity.
Yeah. But with that said, is movement at all time periods does increase?
Yes.
As far as bucks. I mean, they are moving more at those crepuscular periods than they were outside of the rut. They've increased movement at those periods as well. But then also, yes, midday, they're moving a little more.
Yep.
So
Yep.
if you were choosing to take those days off and sit in a deer stand all day long, it may serve you well.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you look at some of the research at the MSU Deer Lab, you saw, that big movement study that wrapped up a couple years ago when they had all the bucks collared. We talked about it a couple times on here. I mean, they went from essentially bucks that were, moving from food and cover most any other time of the year. Now suddenly it's like, okay, well, that's not as important. I'm looking for does. So, they went from moving 2.5 miles per day to about 4 miles per day during peak rut.
Yeah.
And then after you went past peak rut, you started to see that decline again. And so they really do pick it up come rut. And it's all about, hey, the more time I spend moving, the more likely I'm going to come across a receptive doe.
Exactly. And that Wisconsin study showed one of the other take homes from that study, which is, I thought, really interesting. They were looking at movement rates, and they had those deer aged as 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 plus. And the movement rates between yearlings, those 1.5-year-olds and the 3.5-year-olds, they were very similar. The 2.5-year-olds actually had increased movement rates. They were the ones that were searching the hardest. As those deer got a little bit older, they gained a little bit more experience. They know what they're looking for a little bit more. And the yearlings weren't quite as active in the breeding population, right? They still breed. There's no doubt about it, but they're just not quite as active. So those 2.5-year-olds are really, really trying to increase their probability of coming across a receptive doe, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. I guess I just didn't realize there would be a difference right there. But I guess you think about it, them teenagers, man, they're crazy. They were getting after it.
Well, and anecdotally, I just think about the number of deer that I see during peak rut, and it seems, if I have any accuracy with my on the hoof aging, that a lot of 2.5-year-olds, you see them, right? They seem to be a pretty predominant age class during the rut for whatever reason.
Yeah, and you mentioned anecdotally, so I'm going to interject something here real quick. We've said it a couple times about like the weather this and the moon that and this that. Well, I think that we have those successful hunts, and whatever the conditions were during a successful hunt, then we put that in our mind as in, well, this is why it was successful, and we kind of run with that. But in my opinion, and what the research shows is like the weather has more of an influence on us as hunters than it does on movement or the rut or anything else. So I think it's important for us to realize that a lot of what we're seeing is it's not necessarily because of the weather or any other variables. It's because we may have walked a little further, we may have hunted a little longer, those type things. It's interesting. You said anecdotal. I had to throw that in there.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a really important thing to talk about. And, some of the work that Dr. Strickland and Dr. Damaris talked about towards the end there last year when they did the big, huge analysis on the moon phase and the impact of temperature, some of the stuff with the temperature bared out a little bit to have some impact, but certainly not nearly as much as just a natural progression of deer movement across the fall, right? That by and large is what's impacting is that photo period. But yeah, I mean, we have this thing called memory bias, right? You shoot a deer and everything just crystallizes in that moment for you and what you remember. But what you don't think about is what you potentially could have seen if you went on the stand, right? Because we're not hunting on a hot day per se. A lot of us are just limited on time. And so we're trying to pick the conditions that we feel best to get out and get a deer. So there's a lot to be said about that.
Well, and you also think about it. I mean, how many times have you sat for 4 or 5 hours in a deer stand and not seen anything? And then as you're walking back to the truck, you jump up a bunch of deer, maybe the biggest buck you've ever seen. Well, if you would have been hunting right there, that may have been the best hunt you've ever been on in your whole life, but you weren't. You were 300 yards away and you didn't see nothing. So it's important to realize that, and I'm guilty of it. I get it. But we've got, one example at one point in time at one place, and that's the data that we tend to go over in our head. Well, this is why it worked, or this is why it didn't work.
Yep. Yeah. I think that is really important. You start just talking about visibility, right? If you're sitting in a stand where you can only see 100 yards in any direction, or even 150, right? That is very limited relative to where a deer can move.
Yeah.
And we just don't think about that a whole lot, right? We're very concerned about what's right in front of us, and sometimes that just kind of blinds us.
Yeah. Yeah. But that is one thing that makes the rut exciting. I mean, you've got bucks that are running all over the place looking for does. You're hoping that they're going to run in front of you. I mean, that's in my experience, at least, that is that time period is when I tend to see bucks that I had no idea were anywhere around. just like they just showed, and they likely did just show up.
Yeah.
They may have been running from a couple miles away. Who knows? But yeah, it's one reason it's so exciting. That the woods are just on fire with the
So
bugs running wild.
one of the cool things that came out of that buck study that you were talking about before, Jacob, that was wrapped up here a few years ago now. We've long talked about these things called excursions, right?
Mhm.
And some of the data that was collected from that study showed that excursions can occur from bucks to does. And when I say excursion, I just mean basically these deer are moving outside their home range, right? For a relatively long distance. And we think that they're moving to find resources. So during the rut, that'd be a receptive doe, right? So that's when you have all of a sudden new bucks popping up on your cam. They are out looking. They're probably not going to stay there very long because they want to get back to their home range where they're most familiar with that landscape. But they're out trying to find some hot does and look for new resources.
Well, and that's another thing that we had mentioned, that buck to doe ratio. You can also influence the amount of movement that you're seeing with those bucks. If you've got fewer does and they're having to search farther and longer to find receptive does, and you can also expect to see that as you get into that peak rut and you have fewer does that are receptive. Bucks are just starting to move a little further, searching a little harder, things like that.
There's just so much that goes on with all this, right? You just think about a typical home range of a buck, right? And most of the year it might be in its core range, which is a relatively small area within its home range. And then the rut comes in, it's going to make use of all the entire extent of its home range. So you might be seeing deer in different places, and it's just using more of the area that it has available to them, right? And then you have these excursions and you have these different movement strategies, and it becomes pretty complicated, but I think that's in part what makes it so much fun, because you just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, 100%. And there's other things too. So, for example, we're getting geared up this year, and I'm already seeing it. I've worked with a couple of landowners. For example, I was on a site last week, and he had his wheat field looked good, and he's like, "Man, it's usually not, it doesn't get this high. It's usually mowed down." And I was like, "Well, with all the rain that we got this summer, we got quite a bit of deer food, and it's actually persistent on into the fall. And I would suspect that we've got a pretty good acorn crop. If it hadn't hit yet, it will in the next couple of weeks. And when there is food all over the place and does can roll out of bed, get a bite to eat, and roll back right back into bed, you tend to don't not see as much of that running around and that rutting behavior, which is another thing that I suspect a lot of people will be calling about soon. Is I'm not seeing any rutting behavior this year. What's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Bucks aren't going to work any harder than they have to, and if they have does relatively close and available, they're not going to make those big movements like they might in other years.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, we see that every year. If you've got a good acorn crop, you're not going to see, whether it's rut or not rut, you're not going to see deer moving as
Yeah.
much. They don't have to.
Yep.
They're trying to be efficient.
Yep. Deer movement is driven by their stomachs and then reproduction, right? So when you have food that's right there, they don't have to work for it all that much, and you have receptive does that are right there, that's just going to have a natural impact on buck movement.
Yeah. Well, some other things that I thought were interesting, looking at that movement stuff that came out of MSU with Dr. Bronson Strickland, Dr. Steve Damaris, the 60 deer collared. We mentioned it quite a few times, but it's also talking about the bedding sites and stuff. The number of bedding sites, and we tend to think. I think this has kind of been an eye-opening project for me. But you think that deer has a bedding or a bed? We'll call it a bed or a bedding area, and it's just going to go do what it does all day long, and it's going to return to that bed at night, just like we do. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's a little bit more random, or not necessarily random, but a little bit more dispersed, a lot more variable than what we might think or what we've been led to believe, at least in these study sites.
Yeah, dozens and dozens and dozens of specific bedding sites. So just because that deer woke up that morning in one area and you watched it walk through does not mean it's going to bed in that same area that night. And even during the rut, they were seeing that bucks, for the most part, were using about 200-acre home range, daily home range.
Yep.
So if you're within that 200 acres, that's great. If you're not, you may not see anything. You may not see that buck.
Yep. And wasn't it during the rut too that that 200-acre range differed every day? Is a little bit more. Yeah. That was a pretty cool finding from that work.
Yeah, it stuck with about 200 acres, but where that 200 acres moved a little bit each day as they were continuing to search a new area for those receptive does.
Yeah. It kind of puts it into perspective, right? When you actually get your hands on a mature buck and you're successful, and take it one step further for those folks who are looking for a specific mature buck. It's a feat. It's not an easy task.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about hunting wise, that pre-rut and outside of the rut is when you're going to be able to pattern those bucks, or somewhat pattern those bucks, and come up with some type of strategy. Because again, they're deer at that point. They're looking for cover, and then they're looking for food. And, it's a pretty simple life at that point, I guess,
Yep.
for a wild animal, for deer. But come rut, those bucks, that pattern goes out the window.
Yep.
It's just running wild. So I've
Yep.
actually, talked to a few people and heard on many other podcasts and stuff that a lot of people are like, no, I actually don't like the rut if I have a target buck in mind, which I thought was interesting. And then I got to thinking about my own experiences. I was like, yeah, you're right. Once the rut gets here, it's just, who knows? You may never see it again.
Yep. Their movement can be a little bit more unpredictable at that point in time. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So if we take this back to, let's just say August, September, you've got bucks that are shedding their velvet. Their movement rates are starting to increase already. Decreased daylight, increased testosterone, movement starting to increase. You come into that early pre-rut phase where they're starting to hit scrapes. They're hitting rubs. They're moving a little bit more all the way up to the peak breeding. Then after, at least, well, I think a lot of people think of, you have this peak breeding, then you have this lockdown phase, right? You want to talk a little bit about the lockdown phase, or the perception of the lockdown phase, I should say?
Or they find a doe, and then that's just where they're going to be hanging out,
Yep.
not moving much.
Yep. Yeah. You go from peak movement to no movement because they're all locked down.
And we've seen that with study after study, that's not the case.
Yeah.
You do have this tending phase. But again, if you think about that going into estrus, you're talking about a 24 to 48 hour period where that doe is in estrus. So I remember, at least when I was younger, you would think that, okay, well, he's found the one, he's going to be tied up with her for about a week or two. And that's just not the case.
It's not the case. Nope. Those does, like we talked about, they're going to be receptive for 24 to 48 hours. And then a buck is going to tend during the 24 to 48 hours. But it's very difficult for one buck to stay with one doe for that entire time, right? Because they're constantly having to fend off other bucks for the ability to breed that doe. And then even if we have peak breeding occurring over a 2-week time period, not every single doe is coming to estrus during that 1 or 2 day span within the 2-week time period, right? So you have does coming in and out of estrus. You have tending that's going on where bucks are trying to ward off other bucks for breeding opportunities. It's just not quite the way that we're made to believe of this lockdown phase where all the bucks are with the doe and they just aren't moving. That's just not really the case.
Yeah. And then you get those older, more mature bucks, and they become a little bit better at the fending off the other bucks and that kind of thing. But then again, you've got, there's lots of opportunities out there. So a lot of people also believe that the big mature buck is the one doing all the breeding, and that's not the case either.
Yeah. No, and some work that's come out of our captive facility here quite some time ago showed that about 20% of litters is going to have what we call multiple paternity, where if you have a twin, each fawn is going to have a different father, right? And you think about that from a standpoint of a doe, that's pretty advantageous for a doe to ensure that she's going to have successful offspring, right? If you're diversifying the sires that you're breeding with, right? And then you think about it from a buck standpoint, means an individual buck isn't very good at producing a ton of offspring, right? These aren't elk that we're talking about. They don't have harems. They're not exclusively breeding a bunch of females. They're having to work and tend and fight off other bucks for the opportunity for one doe.
Yeah. It's counter to a lot of what we believe, a lot of what I'll speak for myself here. Yeah. And then we could film a whole nother podcast on, record a whole nother podcast on the thoughts of, antler heritability. And, did the buck that you wanted to breed it, and don't take that one until after the rut because there's all sorts of things that go into play there. Again, speaking from my personal experience, but
Yep.
I think the big takeaway with all this is that this is a phenomenon that's going to happen every year. It's exciting. It turns bucks into a different beast altogether. It makes for some really, really fun hunting, but it's very complex. There's a lot that goes into it, a lot that can influence the way that all of this goes, especially from our perspective, I should say. Everything else is kind of set the way that it is, but our perspective on not seeing the rut or the trickle rut or the this or the that, it's interesting. And a lot of that comes down to what we want to believe, based off a couple of experiences. So,
yep. It's funny because obviously we're recording this podcast. It's November 10th. So some of my friends back in Wisconsin, they're in the thick of it right now and just keeping up in the group chats about what they're seeing, phone calls from other friends. And it's really hit or miss, right? Some of my buddies are saying, yep, I'm seeing it. Some buddies are saying, no, we're not. But then you look at the cameras that they've got with their cellular cams, right? And then like we just discussed about visibility. Cameras are showing one thing, they're seeing something totally different, right? So it's happening. If your peak breeding is occurring right now, They're breeding. They're not waiting for anything else. It's occurring. It's just a matter of what you're seeing.
Yeah, and all of this is taking place at night too. It's not
Yes.
just crepuscular periods. It's not just midday. I mean, we mentioned all of the movement earlier and how that works, but they may be running wild at night, and you just didn't see that, and therefore, or you're just sitting 100 yards away from the right spot. So it's always fun, and I have to remind myself this every year. I'm a hunter just like anybody else. I try to put the puzzle together and blame whatever I can blame on any given hunt. But, we have very limited data sets when it
Yep.
comes to personal experience and deer season to deer season. So that's always important to remember.
And it just comes down to scale, right? When we're talking about the breeding season, we're talking about this occurring over a relatively large scale. Now, if you take the average hunting property, just a couple hundred acres or less, or sometimes more, depending on the situation, right? And how many doe groups that your specific property is holding, and then when those individuals are coming into estrus, and then how you're actually able to hunt those individuals and your visibility and all those different things, right? You start really knocking down your percentage, the probability of seeing that rutting activity, right? There's just a lot that goes into it that I don't think we tend to think about.
Well, there are a couple of things that we can do to make sure that we're at least doing the couple of things that we can do. And that is one, keeping our deer densities where they need to be. Harvesting more deer in many locations, at least in Mississippi here, keeping those buck to doe ratios where they need to be. I often think about it as kind of it's not very much different than if you think about livestock producers and stuff. They're trying to make sure that all their cows are bred, and they're bred within a time period that's going to allow those calves to be. It's kind of the same idea here. We want to make sure that we're doing the management we can so the bucks can breed the does, that kind of thing. And then also habitat management to make sure that we're producing habitats, that we've got the nutrition and the cover and things like that. And that's really about all we can do.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it comes down to the very basic things that we have control over. And those are the same things that we talk about all the time.
Yeah.
Speaking of doe,
go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of doe management, do you have a preference for when you're harvesting does, whether it's pre-rut or post-rut, or what point in time during the hunting season?
I don't have a preference. If I need to harvest does, especially when I'm not sure how many hunting opportunities I'm going to have, I tend to just harvest when I can. And also, we eat almost strictly venison. So
yeah,
when it comes to deer season, my freezer is running really low. So I don't pass up too many opportunities.
Yeah. Yep. I think if you need to harvest does, any opportunity you have to harvest does is a good opportunity.
100% agree. 100% agree. One thing that I think we can clearly take away from this, and we could say this on any episode, I guess, but talking about hunting success, you're not going to be successful if you're not out there. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It doesn't matter what your camera's telling you. We need to quit relying on that kind of stuff. Get in the woods, enjoy it, have a good time. Guarantee you'll see more deer and be more successful sitting in the woods than you will sitting on the couch.
Yeah, I agree 100%. An artifact of our day-to-day lives is we just have less and less opportunity, and you want to try to pinpoint when to get out, when it's going to be your best chance. But really, if you have an opportunity and it's 75 degrees or if it's 45 degrees, I mean, get out, do some scouting, just be outside, and you're going to have more of an opportunity than being inside.
Yep. I was able to put a big doe in the freezer on October 2nd, the day after opening day. So that was got that monkey off my back. It was good.
Yeah, it's a good feeling.
Yeah, it's always a good feeling. Talking about hunting, we'll say rut. What's your setup? Peak of the rut. You got 3 days to hunt. What are you doing?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. That's a great question. And a lot of it's going to depend on where you're at, right? So if I'm hunting back in the family farm in southwestern Wisconsin, I'm doing a lot of scouting for pinch points and different, there's so much topography in that part of the state relative to really a lot of the deer's range in the eastern part of the U.S. It makes hunting a little bit different because you have these ridge and valleys. It's about 50% timber, 50% agricultural. They just kind of have a deer haven. So you're looking for pinch points, anything that's going to just really consolidate deer movement. And that can be tough because that might mean you're not seeing a lot of deer movement. You're anticipating deer movement, but that might be where he's moving to scent check bedding areas or whatever it may be. And that's where you're going to get a shot at him. Down here, I'm going to probably look a little bit more at food sources and try to play off of that and how, again, pinch points, but that's going to look a little bit different here in Mississippi than other parts of the country that I've hunted, but really trying to focus in on what's consolidating that movement down to an area that I can get a shot. And now I'm talking about bow hunting, right? That's how I grew up. In Wisconsin, we were bow hunting during peak rut. In Mississippi, you're going to be, have the opportunity to have a rifle in hand. That's going to change, potentially your strategy too. But for me, it's getting up close and personal with those deer and trying to identify those pinch points. What about you?
Same thing. Same thing. I have always been, any time of year actually, I am looking for food right there by cover. It's a little bit more difficult when you've got a giant acorn crop, and lots of
Yep.
cover. We don't have no shortage, or we shouldn't have a shortage of cover in Mississippi. But yeah, when you've got the giant acorn crops, it makes it more difficult. But I've always been about getting as close to cover as I can, and making sure that I'm sitting over a food source, mostly hardwoods this time of year, looking for acorns. But yeah, and I typically year round have a bow in my hand. I tend to bow hunt more than I do rifle hunt. But yeah, same idea for me. I look for those travel corridors as well. If I can find somewhere a natural funnel, I think most people are going to be on that as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, that natural funnel,
Yep.
food source near cover
Yep.
works.
Yep. And it's growing up, there's a couple of trains of thought of whether you should be hunting doe bedding areas or these pinch points or whatever that may be. And I think really it comes down to what's your personal preference, right? People have killed big bucks hunting both scenarios. So I think really I think you hit the nail on the head. Getting out and doing some in-season scouting, that can be really, really important. I mean, especially even during the rut. I mean, if you're just identifying new pinch points, new travel corridors, things you didn't know existed before, you're not going to identify those features if you're not on the ground looking for them.
Yep. And and looking for those acre trees that are producing.
Yeah.
You're not always going to have a super mass crop, but you will have acorns falling year to year. So I'm steadily, even in early season, I've got binoculars where I'm trying to see if I can see acorns at the top of the tree. And also, I guess I should specify that I'm looking for that food and cover, because that's where the does are going to want to be, and the bucks that are running around crazy they're going to be where the
Yep.
does want to be.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. And I think it's like anything else. There's a lot of different strategies that result in success.
Mm-hmm.
But the one common thing amongst all of them is people are out and they're trying it, right? They're trying something different, maybe trying something new for the first time. They're getting out, they're reading the sign, and they're hunting.
Yep. I grew up hunting public land, and so you tended to stay moving, because you couldn't just leave a stand and hunt it all season long. And we've also seen that that's not the way. If you want to be successful, that's typically not how it works. You got to keep on moving and keep learning throughout the season as well, looking for the sign, like you said, and taking advantage of those nutrient pulses, those nutrition pulses, like the mass crop that's going to hit and persist for a month or two, and then maybe they move on to something else. But yeah, got to stay moving around.
Yep. Bucks are going to be moving. They are going to be moving. They're going to be moving most at dusk and dawn. You're going to see increased midday activity, which isn't news to anybody, but I think it's worth, again, reiterating that midday activity is still going to be less than dusk and dawn, but greater, closer to peak rut than at other times of the year. So getting out there and just taking advantage of increased movement in general is a good thing.
100%. So what else? What else on the rut do you think we should mention? Or
wow. Well, we covered, I think one of the big things that we touched on a little bit was the dominance, right? There's not one buck that's going to dominate the breeding, run all the little bucks off, because the doe's coming into estrus and they only have 24 to 48 hours of receptivity, right? To actually breed. So if that buck is locked down for that short amount of time and he's fending off other deer, there's other bucks that are going to have opportunities to breed. And we see that in the data.
Yep. It's been eye-opening. You grow up believing one thing, and then you go to school for this kind of stuff, and you learn some other stuff. And then as technology advances and you just have this ability to do research, like, for example, that tells you where a deer is standing every 15 minutes for 2 years. I mean, it's amazing what you learn, what you thought you knew, what you realize you didn't know. It's a lot of fun. Steadily moving towards the truth. That's what we're doing.
Oh, absolutely. We just talked about this in my techniques class when we're sampling, right? You have a population and the goal is to have a representative sample from the population. So you're reducing bias and you're getting closer to the truth, but we're never going to be able to measure and sample every single animal in a population. We never are going to have 100% certainty, but that's where the science comes in, is that we're randomizing our sampling design and trying to get closest to truth as possible.
Yeah. Very well put. Well, this has been fun.
It's been a lot of fun. It's a great time of the year.
Man, it's my favorite time of the year.
I would agree.
This, and then I'm going to be eating Thanksgiving, the next couple of weeks and the holidays. And it's just it's a beautiful time of year. Yeah. For all y'all deer hunters, get out, enjoy it. The
Good
deer
luck.
are there. They move all day long. So get after it.
Absolutely. Good luck. Be safe.
Yep. Y'all have a good one.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson family for their endowed financial support. We would not be able to do this without it. We're also grateful to our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service, and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center.
If you have questions or ideas, check out msudeerlab.com and hit the Deer University tab. Thanks for listening.